The Veil did not travel between stars the way humans did. They drifted. Their vessels, long, hollow things grown from calcified resin and threaded with bioluminescent nerve channels, moved through space the way a deep-sea creature moves through water. Slowly, deliberately, with patience that had been cultivated across 11,000 years of uninterrupted civilization. Ambassador Soltheron stood at the observation membrane of the endless becoming and watched the blue-white star system grow larger in her field of vision. She had 6 eyes arranged in a gentle arc across her forehead, each one capable of independent focus. Right now, all 6 were pointed at the same thing. The third planet. It was startlingly green and blue, almost aggressively alive-looking. Her cultural advisor, a young male named Perith, floated beside her. His nervous chromatophores flickered pale yellow across his skin, the Veil equivalent of anxious fidgeting. "The signal came from here?" she asked. "From their outer belt, technically," Perith said. "But the species originates from the third planet. They call it Earth." Soltheron said the word quietly to herself. Earth. It meant soil, dirt, ground. A species that named their entire world after the material beneath their feet. She found that oddly moving, like naming the ocean after a single wave. The first contact protocols had already been exchanged over 18 months of careful, layered communication. Mathematical first, then symbolic, then something approximating language. The Veil Concordat had done this 43 times across their history of expansion. Each contact was unique. Each species had surprised them in some way. But the humans had surprised them before first contact was even complete. They had sent 2 things alongside their linguistic package. The first was music. Not a signal, not a greeting. Actual polyphonic music, structured and emotionally complex, that Soltheron had listened to 17 times without fully understanding why it made the nodes along her spine ache with something she could only describe as longing. The second was a warning. "We are coming to meet you. Please be advised. One of our escort vessels is running a stealth system. You will not see it until we choose to reveal it. We are telling you this now so that you are not frightened when it appears. We do not want our first meeting to begin with fear." Soltheron had read that transmission so many times that she had memorized every word. "We do not want our first meeting to begin with fear." In 43 first contacts, across 11,000 years, no species had ever said that first. Always it was the Veil who managed fear. Always it was the Veil who arrived slowly, who dimmed their bioluminescence, who folded their navigational arrays inward to appear smaller, less threatening. They were the experienced ones. The ancient ones, the careful stewards of interspecies relationships. But these humans had thought of it themselves. Unprompted, she turned to Perith. "What do we know about the Dreadnought?" He pulled up the data on his haptic membrane. "The vessel is called the USCS Unconditional. Their records indicate it is one of 7 deep space capital ships in their current fleet. It is," he paused, rechecking the numbers, "considerably larger than our endless becoming." "How considerably?" "Approximately 4 times our displacement. Armed with what their technical summaries describe as variable yield kinetic accelerators and photonic disruption arrays." He paused again. "They sent us the full armament manifest, Ambassador." Soltheron was quiet for a moment. "They sent us everything. Every weapon. Every system. Shield generation capacity. Crew complement. Emergency protocols." He let the haptic membrane dissolve. "I don't know what to make of it. They want us to know exactly how dangerous they are," she said slowly, "and they want us to know anyway." She turned back to the membrane and the growing blue-white star. "That is either the most honest thing a species has ever done, or the most terrifying," Perith finished. She considered both possibilities with all 6 eyes. "Perhaps," she said, "it is both." The human convoy arrived 4 days later. 3 vessels emerged from their faster-than-light corridor, a shimmer in space that the Veil had no biological equivalent for, and which several of the endless becoming's crew watched with naked awe. The corridor burst open, releasing the ships, and then resealed itself, akin to a wound healing in reverse. The 2 smaller vessels were diplomatic carriers. The 2 smaller vessels, smooth-hulled and elegant even by Vale standards, were painted in the deep navy blue of whatever governing body the humans had sent. The larger vessel, the Unconditional, was different. It was dark, almost perfectly dark. Even to the 6 independent photoreceptors in Sol Theron's eyes, it registered as an absence rather than a presence. The shape appeared as if it had been cut out of the star field, angular where the Vale vessels were curved, hard where theirs were soft. It simply sat there the way a geological feature sits, without apology, without posturing, just present. That, Pereth whispered, is not something that was grown. No, Sol Theron agreed. It was built. There was a difference, philosophical, almost spiritual, in how the Vale understood it. Their ships were cultivated organisms. They lived and breathed and were in constant communion with their crew. The Endless Becoming knew her passengers the way a body knows its cells. The human vessel possessed no knowledge of its surroundings. It had been made, assembled from extracted and processed raw materials, and forced into shape by tools, heat, and intention. It was an act of will pressed into metal. Sol Theron found it simultaneously impressive and deeply melancholy, a cathedral built in a desert by people who had never seen rain. The communication channel opened. The voice that came through was female, measured, and carried with it something in the acoustic lower register that resonated in Sol Theron's spine nodes again, the same way the music had. Ambassador Sol Theron. This is Admiral Reyes of the USCS Unconditional. We are grateful for your patience and your openness. We are ready to begin formal proceedings whenever you are comfortable. There is no urgency on our side. No urgency. Sol Theron almost smiled, which for a Vale involved a slow brightening of the brow chromatophores. Humans communicated a great deal through what they chose to say they were not doing. She opened the return channel. Admiral Reyes. We are equally grateful, and equally without urgency. She paused. Your vessel is impressive. I hope you will forgive me for looking at it rather more than is probably polite. A beat of silence. Then, I'll pass that along to the crew. They'll be pleased. They've been told not to be intimidating, which for the Unconditional, a group characterized by their unwavering nature, is a structural challenge. Pereth made a sound behind her. She recognized it after a moment. She had heard recordings of it in the human cultural packages. Laughter. He was laughing. She brightened her chromatophores further. Perhaps this would go well. The formal first contact ceremony was held aboard a neutral platform, a station the Vale had seeded into the system's outer belt 3 years earlier, specifically in anticipation of this meeting. Sol Theron had insisted on this. Neutral ground was not merely symbolic. It was neurological. Both species would process the interaction differently on territory neither owned. She arrived with a delegation of 12. She had read enough of the human transmissions to know what to expect. Physically bilaterally symmetric, limited chromatic expression, and surprisingly varied in size and coloring. She had studied the images and the video records. She had prepared herself. She was not, it turned out, fully prepared. There is a difference between knowing a thing and encountering it. Sol Theron knew humans were warm-blooded. She had not anticipated how present that warmth would be, how she would feel it on the surface of her skin before they were even close. She had no idea it would register as a constant, involuntary, and strangely intimate biological broadcasting. Admiral Reyes was a compact woman with gray at her temples and eyes the color of deep water, a brown so dark it read almost black in dim light. She walked with the controlled precision of someone who spent a great deal of time in low gravity and had trained herself not to let it become a habit. Beside her was the officer Sol Theron had been briefed on only briefly, Eli Vasquez, the Unconditional's chief systems engineer. He had been included in the diplomatic party somewhat unusually, at the Admiral's request, for reasons that had not been fully explained. Vasquez was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked, she searched her cultural vocabulary for the right word, tired. Not in a deficient way. It was as if Vasquez had been carrying a heavy load for a considerable amount of time, and he had simply integrated the weight into his posture. He stood slightly behind, and to the left of the Admiral. He was watching the Veil delegation with an expression that Sol Theron's cultural training identified as intense curiosity restrained by professional discipline. His eyes moved. They catalogued. But he kept his hands still. She noticed his hands particularly. Long finger, marked with small scars. These were the hands of a person skilled in working with physical systems, who could reach into machinery and comprehend its inner workings. The ceremony proceeded. Words were exchanged that had been carefully prepared over months of communication. Gifts were presented. The veil brought a resonance crystal grown in the deep chambers of a dying star, and the humans brought a sealed drive containing the entirety of their recorded music, which Sol Theron accepted with both hands and something very close to reverence. It was going beautifully. Then, 40 minutes into the reception that followed the formal ceremony, while Sol Theron was in conversation with Admiral Reyes about the structural philosophy of Veil ship design, genuinely absorbed, genuinely hopeful, a junior officer appeared at the Admiral's shoulder. He leaned close and spoke quietly. Rhea's expression did not change, but her posture did. It was subtle. She experienced a slight straightening of her spine. There was a subtle shift in the angle of her jaw. Sol Theron had spent 11 years studying human behavioral recordings, and she recognized it anyway. Something had gone wrong, possibly indicating a significant deviation from expected patterns in the data she had analyzed. Reyes turned to Vasquez. One word passed between them. Caro. Vasquez closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. He then opened his eyes and asked calmly, "How bad is it?" The junior officer declared a complete shutdown. The stealth array just stopped. All of it. We're sitting in open space broadcasting our full signature. Sol Theron heard every word. The Veil cultural concept of Ithamorn had no clean translation in any human language, as far as Sol Theron knew. The closest approximation was the vulnerability of full visibility.
It wasn't exactly shame.
It was the specific, acute discomfort of having your interior state legible to others without your permission. This refers to being stripped of the social architecture that allowed one to curate one's own presentation. Watching Admiral Reyes absorb the news that the Unconditional had lost its stealth capability, completely, without warning, in the middle of a first contact event, Sol Theron recognized Ithamorn in a human face for the first time. She made a decision quickly. "Admiral," she said, and the gentleness in her voice was deliberate, "perhaps we could step into a quieter room." Reyes looked at her. For a moment, the professional mask was perfectly intact. Then, almost imperceptibly, it shifted. "You heard. My sensory range is somewhat broader than yours. I apologize, it was not intentional." "No need to apologize." Rhea's jaw was tight. She stopped. Began again. "This is not what we wanted your introduction to us to look like. You are worried," Sol Theron said, "that we will think you deceptive, that the ship you told us was hidden is now exposed, and that its exposure will seem like a demonstration of threat." Reyes met her eyes steadily. "Yes. I do not think that. With respect, Ambassador, you've known us for approximately 40 minutes. Sol Theron brightened her chromatophores, the slow, warm brightness that in Veil's expression indicated something between reassurance and admiration. "In those 40 minutes, Admiral, your species has made us music, sent us your complete weapons manifest, and now experienced a significant mechanical failure with a dignity I find genuinely remarkable." She paused. "I am not worried about your intentions. I am curious about your problem." A silence. Then Reyes said, "Vasquez." Commander Vasquez straightened. "I need to get back to the ship." "I know. The ghost down it's not a simple failure. If it were simple, it would have been fixed before it reached critical. Something in the harmonic sequencing of the phase array has collapsed, and I don't understand the full extent of the damage or how it can be repaired." He stopped. His hands moved slightly at his sides. Sol Theron noticed it as an unconscious gesture, as though he were already reaching for tools he didn't have. "I need to see it." "Go," Reyes said. "Take Chun and Park." He nodded once and left. At the door he paused and looked back, not at Reyes but at Sol Theron. His eyes held that same cataloging quality. But there was something else in them now, something personal and precise, like the look of someone who had just encountered a problem they genuinely did not yet understand, and were not embarrassed to admit it. "Sorry about this," he said. It was an odd thing to say to an alien ambassador at first contact. Sol Theron found it absolutely perfect.
"Do not be," she said.
"Things that break are things that were built with ambition." He was quiet for a moment. Then he left. The unconditional stealth system was called, in its technical documentation, the Halo-class Phase Displacement Array, HCPDA. The engineering team, who lived with, maintained, cursed at, and occasionally celebrated the stealth system, informally called it the Veil. Vasquez had been its primary engineer for 6 years. He understood the Veil the way a musician understands a difficult instrument, not just technically but intuitively. He knew its sounds. He knew the particular vibration in the deckplate that meant the phase oscillators were running hot. He knew the color of a healthy harmonic sequence on the monitoring display and the color of an unhealthy one, and the difference was not something he could fully articulate but something he recognized immediately. What he found when he boarded the unconditional and descended to the array chamber was something he did not recognize. The system was mostly undamaged. Nothing was broken in the conventional sense. No burned components. No severed connections. The diagnostic results were healthy for every subsystem. Power flow was nominal. Sequencing software was operational. And yet the Veil was completely down. He stood at the central monitoring console for a long time, not touching anything, just looking. Chun and Park stood back and let him. They had worked with him long enough to know that this was his process. The still, complete attention he brought to a problem before he introduced any action into the system. He was thinking about the third planet. He contemplated the fact that they found themselves in a new star system, orbiting a star with a slightly distinct radiation profile, situated in a region of space that had never been inhabited by a human vessel before. They had spent 18 months communicating with the Veil across the distance. 18 months of signal exchange had traversed. What exactly? What kind of spatial medium? What type of electromagnetic environment was it operating in? The Veil operated on harmonic interference. It generated a precise, calibrated phase signature that caused the ship's electromagnetic emissions to cancel each other out, rendering it functionally invisible to active and passive sensors. But that calibration was built against a model. The calibration was based on a baseline space model. This model was derived from the human experience of exploring regions. He turned slowly. "When did this start?" he asked. 16 hours ago, Chun said. There was a gradual decline, followed by a complete collapse 2 hours prior to the ceremony, Chun stated. 16 hours. He turned back to the display. "We entered this system 20 hours ago." Park understood first. The local medium. The spatial electromagnetic profile of this system is different from anything in our calibration baseline, Vasquez said. Not dramatically. The difference is not significant enough to impact propulsion, weapons, or communications. But the Veil is a precision instrument. It doesn't need a dramatic difference. It needs a 4-part harmonic sequence that cancels against a specific background. He gestured at the display. "We're trying to tune a string instrument that doesn't know it's on a different planet." Chun exhaled slowly. "Can you recalibrate?" "I need a full spectral analysis of the local medium, which I don't have." "How long can I get one?" Vasquez looked at the display for a long moment. "That's the problem," he said. 12 hours minimum. Maybe 20. And I need a reference point, something that's already calibrated to this environment. He paused. Something that belongs here. Sol Theron was not supposed to know the details of the engineering problem. She had been briefed by Reyes, diplomatically, carefully. In the broad strokes, the stealth system had experienced an unexpected failure. Human engineers were working to resolve it, and there was no cause for concern. The formal diplomatic phrasing meant, "Please don't worry about the thing we are worried about." But Pereth had been listening to the internal communications chatter through the station's sensor array.
He was not supposed to do this either.
He reported his findings to Sol Theron with the expression of someone unsure whether his actions were appropriate, yet he proceeded because it seemed important. She heard him out.
She sat with it for a long time.
Pereth watched her chromatophores cycle through a slow, complex pattern he had learned, in years of working with her, to respect as thinking. Then she said, quietly, almost to herself, HFY. It was an old Vale phrase. Literally, in the most direct translation, it meant, now from me. But its idiomatic meaning was richer than that. It was the phrase spoken before an act of deliberate, considered giving. Before, one offered something of value without being asked. It acknowledged the gift's weight and the offer's risk. Giving something unprompted was to make oneself known, to perform Ithamorn voluntarily. It was a conscious decision to make oneself visible. She stood. Find Commander Vasquez. Ambassador. He has a problem I can help with. And it will be better, for everything that comes after this, if the help comes now. Before it is asked for. Before we negotiate it. She smoothed her outer membrane, the veil equivalent of adjusting one's collar. There are things that can only be given freely. The moment they are requested, they become something else. Perith was quiet for a moment. What do we have that he needs? She met his eyes. Our ships have been living in this star system for 3 years. Our navigation systems have been in constant harmonic exchange with this medium since before the first signal. We have the most complete spectral profile of this local electromagnetic environment that exists. She moved toward the door. And I would like very much to give it to him. Vasquez was in the middle of his 4th read-through of the diagnostic data when the door to the engineering bay opened and Ambassador Soltheron walked in. He stared. She was tall, almost 2 meters, with the particular posture of a species that had evolved in lower gravity, a kind of loose, fluid verticality that made her look like she was in constant gentle motion, even when standing still. Her 6 eyes tracked independently for a moment as she took in the space, and then, with a focused deliberateness that he found unexpectedly moving, they all converged on him. Commander Vasquez, she said, I understand you need a spectral resonance map of this star system. He did not ask how she knew. Yes. Our navigational archives contain 3 years of continuous harmonic mapping for this medium. It is, at this moment, the most accurate record of the local electromagnetic environment that exists. She held out a data crystal, a veil storage medium, organic, bioluminescent, and warm to the touch. I would like to give this recording to you. He did not reach for it immediately. She watched him with all 6 eyes. She saw him working through it, saw the precise, methodical mind calculating not the engineering value of the data that was obvious, that was immediate, but the implications. She was struck by the significance of his gesture. What it meant was that she had it. What it meant was that she was offering it without being asked. What was the significance of accepting it? This is your navigational data, he said. This would give us a detailed map of how your ships move through this system. Yes. That's sensitive. It is. Why would you? Because, she said, you told us you had a hidden ship. You didn't have to do that. You could have told us whenever, and we wouldn't have known you warned us. The warning itself gave us nothing tactical. It gave us something else.
She paused.
I have been thinking about what to call what it gave us, and the closest I can find in your language is precedent. You established a precedent of choosing transparency when concealment was easier. Vasquez was quiet. HFY, she said. Now for me. I would like to establish the same precedent. He looked at the crystal. It was warm. He could feel it from a few centimeters away, the same biological warmth he had noticed in the Vale since they arrived, constant and involuntary and strangely honest. The system naturally produced heat as a byproduct of its operation. He took it. Thank you, he said. It came out quieter than he intended. She brightened, a slow, warm luminescence across her brow, and he did not know exactly what it meant, but it felt like the right response. The recalibration took 9 hours. Vasquez barely slept. Chun and Park worked in shifts, but he was present for all of it, running the spectral analysis from the Vale data, building a new baseline model for the local electromagnetic environment, and systematically retuning the Vale's harmonic sequence against this revised understanding of the space it was operating in. It was painstaking work. Not dramatic, no single moment of breakthrough, no sudden revelation. Just careful, iterative adjustment.
Testing.
Measuring. Testing again. The way that most real engineering actually worked, underneath the mythology of sudden inspiration. What he found, as he worked deeper into the Veil data, was something he had not expected. The spectral profile of this star system was not simply different from human-explored space. It was structured differently. It had a layered complexity, electromagnetic strata, almost like geological layers, each with its own harmonic properties that his instruments had not been designed to detect. The Veil navigational system had been recording it for 3 years because their ships felt it. Their bioluminescent nerve channels were sensitive to electromagnetic gradients in ways that human-built sensors were not. Their ships were, in a very literal sense, listening to the medium they moved through. He sat with this for a long time. There was something in it that reached past the engineering problem and into something else, a question he had not known he was carrying. He had spent 6 years with the Veil, dedicated to the art of making something invisible, of canceling out a signal so precisely that it effectively ceased to exist to outside observers. And here was a species that had spent 11,000 years doing the opposite, building vessels that were in constant, sensitive communion with their environment, not canceling the signal, listening to it. He was not sure he could explain fully what happened in him at that moment. It was not a conversion or a revelation. It was quieter than that. More like the sensation of a correction that has been needed for a long time, finally made. He went back to work. By hour 9, the Veil came back online. He stood and looked at the display and the clean, perfectly sequenced harmonics of a recalibrated stealth field, and he felt, not triumph, not the satisfaction he usually felt when a system came back to life. Something more complicated. He opened a channel to Admiral Reyes. Ghost is back up, Admiral. A pause. Then, good work, Vasquez. It wasn't just my work. Another pause. I know. He closed the channel. Then he sat in the quiet of the array chamber for a long time, his long-fingered hands resting in his lap, looking at nothing in particular. Admiral Reyes met with Ambassador Sol Theron the following morning. It was an unofficial meeting, requested by Reyes herself, held in the station's small observation room with no diplomatic staff present on either side. Sol Theron brought Perith because she brought him everywhere. Reyes brought a thermos of coffee and 2 cups, one of which she set on the table in front of Sol Theron and then, when she saw the ambassador's expression, said, "You don't have to drink it. I just didn't want to be the only one with a cup." Sol Theron found the situation so deeply characteristic of everything she was learning about humans that she had to spend a moment stabilizing her chromatophores. "Thank you," she said, and wrapped both hands around the cup, which was warm. They sat in silence for a moment, looking at the star field through the observation membrane. The unconditional was out there, invisible again, its stealth field restored, its presence once more theoretical rather than visible. "I want to ask you something," Reyes said. "Please." "When you gave Vasquez that data, the navigational archive, you had to know what it contained, what it could be used for." "Yes." "You didn't negotiate. You didn't attach conditions."
No.
Reyes turned her cup slowly. "That's not how we do things. Tactically speaking, we'd call it an asymmetric exchange. You gave us something that increased our capability in the system without asking for anything in return." "I asked for precedent," Sol Theron said. "I told you that. A precedent isn't a binding agreement." "No," Sol Theron said. "It is something better." She turned her cup in her hands. "Admiral, we have contacted 43 species across 11,000 years. And I can tell you that of those 43, the ones with whom the Concordat has the deepest and most durable relationships are not the ones with whom we negotiated the most carefully. They are the ones who did something generous before it was required, before the structure was in place to demand it." She looked at the Admiral steadily with all 6 eyes. "The binding agreements come later. They are maintained by interest. But the relationship, the actual connection between people, is built from moments like the one your commander experienced on that station. And the one your species had 18 months ago, when you sent a warning about a hidden ship." Reyes was quiet for a long time. "We almost didn't send that warning," she said. "There was a significant internal debate. Arguments about tactical transparency, about not revealing our capabilities before." "I know," Sol Theron said. "I assumed." "What made you assume that?" Because it was the right thing to do, and right things are rarely the easy consensus. If your leadership had agreed immediately, I would have suspected it was calculated. The fact that it was debated, that tells me it was genuine. Reyes made a sound. Not quite laughter. Something drier and more tired. You're more cynical than I expected an 11,000-year-old civilization to be. Sol Theron's chromatophores warmed. We have been doing this for 11,000 years, Admiral. Cynicism is not the opposite of hope. Sometimes it is in its most honest form. 6 months later, Vasquez submitted a technical paper to the Human Colonial Science Consortium. It was dense, full of equations and harmonic modeling and electromagnetic theory, and the majority of its content was incomprehensible to anyone who is not a specialist. But its conclusion, in the final 3 pages, was written in plain language, and it was read by a great many people who had no engineering background whatsoever. He wrote about the veil. He wrote about the 9-hour process of recalibration, about the spectral profile of a star system that human instruments had not been built to understand, and a dataset grown from 3 years of a living vessel's communion with its environment. He wrote about the difference between canceling a signal and listening to one. And in the final section, the one that was excerpted and circulated and argued about in conference rooms and government chambers and university seminars for years afterward, he wrote this: "We built the veil to make ourselves invisible because we were afraid. That is the honest origin of stealth technology. Not strategy.
Fear.
We did not know what was out there, and invisibility felt like safety. The Veil navigational system does the opposite. Their ships feel the space they move through. They are not invisible to their environment. They are in conversation with it. When I recalibrated our stealth field using their data, I had to build a model of a world our instruments couldn't see. I had to understand what it felt like to listen before I could understand what it meant to hide. I am not arguing that stealth technology is wrong or that we should dismantle it. I am saying that I spent 6 years understanding only half of the problem. The half about concealment. The Veil data gave me the other half, and the other half is about presence. There is a version of security that comes from being unknown, and there is a version that comes from being understood. We spent 18 months trying to make ourselves known to another species, and the relationship that resulted has been, in my experience, the most efficient security arrangement the USCS has ever entered into. Not because we negotiated well, because we told the truth first. The paper was not universally praised. Several senior USCS officials found it politically inconvenient. One prominent admiral called it philosophically interesting and strategically naive. Vasquez accepted both responses with the same equanimity. He had stopped being invested in whether people agreed with him. He was interested in whether they were thinking. The endless becoming returned to the human frontier 14 months after first contact. It was not a diplomatic visit, exactly. More of a continuation. Sol Theron had been formally assigned as the Concordat's permanent liaison to human space, a position that had no real precedent in Veil institutional history because the Concordat had never before created a permanent liaison post this early in a relationship. It was, as Pereth noted with his characteristic understatement, irregular. She arrived to find unconditional waiting. This was not in the official itinerary. The Dreadnought had not been assigned to the meeting. It was there because, as Admiral Reyes explained, with a tone that suggested she had authorized this somewhat unilaterally, Vasquez had asked to be present. He was waiting at the docking port when Sol Theron's shuttle came in. He looked slightly less tired than he had 14 months ago, which she registered as significant. He was holding something. It was a Veil data crystal, but not one of theirs. It was smaller and denser, and when she took it from his hands, she felt the particular resonant warmth of something that had been built recently, with great care. She turned it in her fingers. The bioluminescent core pulsed softly. "You made this," she said.
"We made it," he said.
6 of our engineers. And Pereth he helped remotely, over about 4 months of correspondence. He looked at the crystal in her hands. It's a harmonic resonance map, but not of a star system. She looked up. It's a mapping of the electromagnetic overlap between Veil biological systems and human-built sensor arrays, he said. The frequencies we share. These are the frequencies that allow both our instruments and your ships to communicate with each other.
He paused.
the places where we're already in conversation, without knowing it. Sol Theron held the crystal and felt its warmth for a long moment. She understood what it was. Not a weapon. Not a navigational tool. It isn't specifically a scientific instrument.
A gift.
Given before it was asked for. This present was given because a precedent had been established, and someone had decided to maintain it. HFY. She looked at Vasquez for a long time with all 6 eyes. "You were not supposed to be here today," she said. "No," he agreed. "You came anyway." "I didn't want the first time you received this to be in a formal setting." He paused, and in the pause she could see the same thing she had seen 14 months ago on that station. The careful, internal struggle of someone communicating something true in a language that was not quite built for it. Some things are better given without an audience. Sol Theron's chromatophores, which are specialized cells that can change color, warmed to the deepest, richest gold she had shown in years. "Yes," she said. "They are." 20 years later, the USCS and the Vale Concordat signed the Harmonic Accord, the most comprehensive mutual security and knowledge-sharing agreement in the history of either civilization. It was negotiated over 4 years, and the negotiation was difficult. There were impasses and regressions and moments when it seemed the whole thing would collapse under the weight of institutional distrust and competing interests and the simple, grinding difficulty of 2 species trying to write rules for a relationship that was already older and richer than any treaty language could hold. But it held. The signing ceremony was held in the original neutral station at the outer belt of the 3rd planet, Earth. Sol Theron signed for the Concordat. The human delegation was led by a diplomat she had not worked with directly, a careful and skilled man named Torres who had done much of the final negotiation work. Vasquez was not there. He had retired from the USCS 3 years earlier and was living somewhere quiet on Earth, working, she had heard, on something to do with harmonic sensing technology, a civilian application of the research that had begun in the array chamber of the Unconditional on a difficult night. After the ceremony, Sol Theron stepped alone into the observation room where, 20 years before, she had shared a cup of coffee with Admiral Reyes and said things she had not planned to say. She stood at the membrane and looked at the star field. The Unconditional was not there. That vessel had been decommissioned 5 years earlier, retired with what the USCS, United States Civil Service, called full honors. She understood those words to mean that a community had acknowledged the weight of a history that an object had carried and found a formal way to release it. But somewhere out there, currently invisible to her instruments, was its successor, the USCS Irreducible, newer and larger and equipped with stealth technology that had been redesigned using the principles Vasquez had written about. The USCS Irreducible was not simply designed to cancel the signal. The first step involved listening to the space. Understanding the medium before choosing how to move through it. She had read the technical summary. The Vale Mark IV was 30% more effective than its predecessor. But more intriguing to her was a small addition to the engineering notes, a single line in the operational guidelines that read, "Prior to activation, the system performs a baseline harmonic survey of the local electromagnetic environment. This is not optional. Understanding where you are is how you know how to be invisible." She touched the observation membrane lightly. Behind her, Perith appeared in the doorway. "They're asking for you at the reception." "Yes," she said, without turning. In a moment, he waited, understanding her. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me the first time we discussed the human warning about the hidden ship?" "I said it was either the most honest thing a species had ever done," he said, "or the most terrifying." "And I said perhaps both." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the membrane, the 3rd planet hung blue and green and aggressively alive, the way it always had. The way it had long before anyone in this room existed, and would long after. "I was wrong," she said. "It was not terrifying at all. I understand that now." She turned from the membrane. "A species is terrifying when it does not know itself. Those humans." She paused, and her chromatophores shifted through a slow and complex pattern that Perith, in all the years they had worked together, had learned to read as something between tenderness and profound respect. They were afraid. They knew they were afraid. And they chose transparency anyway. She moved toward the door. "That is not terrifying. That is the only brave thing. She walked through the door and into the light and noise of the celebration, and behind her the observation membrane held the star field steady and silent, the way it always did, full of things that were present and things that were hidden and the long, patient distance between them.
End.